Hello, welcome to our weekly webcast with Helga Zepp LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. Today is the 4th of January 2023. We're embarking on a year that has a tremendous potential for change, but also a continuing dynamic of war coming from the interests behind the Unipolar Order, the City of London in particular, the corporate cartels. Helga, one of the things that came out in the last weeks of 2022 was the confirmation from Merkel and then from former French President Hollande that the Minsk Accords were never intended to be a policy of peace and reconciliation between Ukraine and Russia, but a time to allow for the buildup of the Ukrainian military. In other words, they were committed to a war against Russia going back to 2014. What are the implications of that in terms of the broader diplomatic situation?
Well, first of all, I'm sure that this subject will be a matter of discussion among many countries and many think tanks and politicians and concerned people, because the implication of that is really huge. Because, this was not just lying about the intention, but, there was actually a UN resolution 2202, which basically made the agreement of the Minsk agreement, international law. And by admitting that they couldn't care less about that, Merkel and Hollande, they basically say, we don't care about people's law. It doesn't matter to us. And this, after the United States has already demonstrated that many times by, not sticking to UN resolutions concerning wars, of interventionist wars and all kinds of things. We saw the lying in the case of Libya, for example, where they lied to the UN Security Council. So this is an erosion of international law. And that comes from those people who are, taking a mouthful every 2 minutes about the rules-based order. Now that clearly shows that the rules-based order is in complete violation and contradiction to international law. That's not new, but it's an incredible, scandalous confirmation. Now, Merkel, I must say, I never thought highly of her because I always thought she was mediocre. But this is really even going beyond that. And, in the case of Hollande, I think he has deserved now the nickname, the Lying Dutchman. This is a pun on Hollande, which, means also Holland, the Dutch, the Netherlands, and the opera, the Flying Dutchman, in German is the Fliegende Holländer, which you can now change into the Lügende Holländer. And I think in French it works as well. So I would hope that a lot of people repeat that to make it stick, because it's actually, ironic, but also very, very important that people always remind themselves about the lying character of the so-called Western leaders. Now, the implication of that is really incredible, because if you think about it, and I actually looked it up, I looked put in some search machines and looked Minsk Accord, sanctions, and for years, all kinds of politicians were always saying, that the sanctions against Russia can only be lifted after the full implementation of the Minsk Accord. And, you can be sure if Merkel and Hollande were saying that, and Poroshenko, Putin was the only one in that quartet who, obviously did believe that they meant it seriously. But, that means that they were all the time, the entire EU leadership was lying all the time about when they said the sanctions can only be lifted after the Minsk Accord is implemented, while they were arming the Ukrainian for a coming war, and only Putin was patient. Now, I think that that whole thing needs to be discussed and reflected upon, because it does take apart the story about that Russia committed this war in an unprovoked fashion, a war of aggression, unprovoked. Obviously, this was built up for a very long time. And it does fit. If you look at these 9 packages of sanctions, actually, I looked them all up, and it's step by step more strangulation of the economy, and that was the plan from the time go. Probably before the Maidan coup, which Nuland, was famous in saying, that the State Department had spent $5 billion on preparing color revolutions. So, the aim from the beginning obviously was to, as Baerbock is saying repeatedly, to ruin Russia. And that was even repeated by these 2 unnamed White House officials on the 25th of February a year ago, that is before the so-called war of aggression started, where these 2 unnamed White House officials said that the aim is to cut Russia off any ability to diversify from oil and gas, to deny them any modern technology. And basically, that already was incredible, because how are you authorized to say that you want to prevent another country from their right to development? So the whole thing is really becoming very, very transparent. But the implication of it is severe, because now the Russians are saying, like Foreign Minister Lavrov is saying, that they will do no more any project together with the EU, because the trust has been completely destroyed. And that is something which will be very, very difficult to repair, because this is really a treason, a betrayal over 8 years. So I think the implication of that is incredibly, and I would really hope that a lot of people who are concerned about the condition of the world would engage in a discussion about what that implies about the values of the West.
Well, Helga, what you just went through is, number one, completely verifiable based on real facts, not the so-called fact checking that's done by the operatives of the pro-war grouping. But secondly, if this were known to people, it would be clear that it's the West that should be put up for war crimes and trials. Now, if you say these things, though, in the West, you're accused of disinformation. What's interesting, though, is that people in the South, the global South, are not buying it. They actually are seeing a different picture, aren't they?
Yes. If you look, it's difficult to look at things with the perspective of a historian, because we are in the middle of events. But, one could try to think, if you look at, the world as if it would be looked at by a historian. It may not be accurate completely, but it helps you to look the longer arc of developments. And from that standpoint, I think it's already very clear that the West thought that they are so clever, so devious, that they can really pull this off big time. But I think they're miscalculating completely, because they've tried to impose this world domination of the unipolar world, putting sanctions on Russia until the Russian economy would be strangulated, force everybody into a so-called democracy alliance. But then you look at it, and what you see is that the exact opposite is happening. And I just was reading an article by a Chinese scholar, Wang Wen. Actually, he's the dean of the Chongyang Financial Institute of Renmin University. And he said that the word of 2022 is not, as Scholz was saying, or Scholz coined this word, epochal change, Zeitenwende. but which now all kinds of institutions have made the word of the year, epochal change. So what Wang Wen says, and I think this is quite interesting, he says the real keyword of 2022 will be de-westernization. And then he goes through to describe how many countries in the world are actually absolutely trying to distance themselves from the West, pursuing their own interest. And he goes through the many countries in Latin America where now 80% of the governments are so-called left governments. I don't want to comment on that, but all of them trying to get a distance from this geopolitical confrontation between the US and China. Then naturally the Central Asian countries, the southwestern countries, the so-called Middle East, Africa. So you have the BRICS plus 17 countries have applied to become members in the BRICS. The SCO, the Eurasian Economic Union, many countries in Africa, the famous shift by the Arabs, Saudi Arabia and others. So, I think this has backfired completely. And, by trying to impose something which most countries do not regard as their own interest, they have actually helped to catalyze a new world economic order. And I think this has some hidden justice to it, which, one should really think about that, the effort to impose an unipolar world was clearly not met with enthusiasm, but the countries of the global south did not answer with confrontation, but they more or less quietly went the other way, putting their own interest in the center of their activities. And I think that has created quite a completely different dynamic in the world.
And you mentioned the movement of nations from the South, especially around the BRICS. This last week was the inauguration of the new president of Brazil, which was an opportunity for diplomatic discussion that was precisely of this nature, the move toward a new system of integration, of common benefit, and so on. And yet you still have people like Robert Kagan, the famous neocon, Mr. Victoria Nuland, writing an article saying that stability depends on the unipolar world. People have to look at these neocons and just identify that they've got more than one screw loose in their head, don't they?
Well, I think this new article by Robert Kagan in Foreign Affairs is, people should really read that, because it's in one sense, it's completely off reality, but it also is an incredible sign of intention to bully people. And you should also look at Robert Kagan and think your own thoughts about it. But it's not going to work. It's based on an arrogant view of the world, and the best it could accomplish is the annihilation of civilization. That remains a danger. I don't want to play down that danger, especially now, because what we have been mentioning already in some previous shows is happening, that I think 2022 will be an effort to go global with NATO. Unfortunately, the Japanese government's decision to double their military budget is absolutely pointing in this direction. But they are the minority. They can beef up their weapon systems to the wahoo, but it's not going to change the main dynamic in the world, which is that the vast majority of countries in the world want to have peace, win-win cooperation, overcoming poverty, and not submitting any longer to these imperial designs.
One of the targets of global NATO continues to be China, and yet we're seeing an interesting potential diplomatic development with Marcos Jr., the president of the Philippines, going to China for a series of talks this week. Now, just to come back to the Ukraine situation, the German government continues to be putting itself in a position of being a partner in the war with the stationing of U.S. planes in Germany, What do you think this represents? I mean, the complete lack of a conception of where this is headed from the German government.
Well, the US is now putting 6 US fighter jets of the type EA-18 Growler into Spangdahlem, into the US base there. Now, these are planes which are supposed to knock down the air defense of the opponent. Now, that plus the training of Ukrainian troops. I mean, Germany makes itself more and more a party in the war. And, I mean, this government is not defending German interests. That has to be said very clearly. I mean, the fact that they know who blew up Nord Stream 2, and they're not saying a mumbling word about it. They are making Germany the vessel of these imperial designs. I think it's high time that people start to discuss that. I mean, what Habeck is doing with his various economic policies, which are, I mean, they are so incompetent that, it's unbelievable that the German industry still tolerates somebody who is only pursuing his green ideology. He has no idea that he's ruining the German economy right now. You have this Baerbock woman who is running around doing absolute damage to the image of Germany in the world, apart from trying to do the poodle job for Blinken, who, by the way, is a close friend of Robert Kagan. So it's all one group. I think this German government is really a problem. I think that they're ruining Germany right now, and even the head of the DGB, Mrs. Fahimi, I think is her name. She said that we are looking at the complete deindustrialization of Germany, and I think it's high time that that there is a reorientation of the policy. And just to mention it, as if it would not be the right of democracy and free speech to say that you have a different view than the government. Are we living in a dictatorship? Immediately, Reuters, of all places, they put out an article saying that there are forces inside Germany who are trying to change the course of policy of Berlin. Yeah, sure. If the government is screwing up, then you have the right to criticize it. And supposedly this is the sign of a democracy. So, I think it's really high time that either this government changes itself or one should change the government.
We also see with the release of the Twitter files that it wasn't just Twitter that was involved in this, but all the government agencies in the intelligence community and so on. Helga, I want to go now to one of your important initiatives, the support for the call from the Vatican for negotiations with the Vatican as a venue for that. This is gaining a lot of support, but there are also people who just don't seem to understand it, who are critical of you for putting this out. So I think it'd be worthwhile for you to just talk for a moment about the importance of this initiative.
Yeah, well, I mean, as of now, because and as a result of what Merkel and Hollande did, the Russians have given up, from everything one can see according to their statements, the hope that this can be solved, that the Ukraine situation can be solved through diplomacy. And it looks to me, and I'm not claiming that I know the innermost thinking of the Russian military, but as they say, and what I also observe, is they think that this must be settled on the battlefield, that the Russian military must, win. That's the Russian position. But then you have the Western side who says, no, we cannot allow that. Ukraine must win. And we must send more heavy weapons, and Leopard 2 is in the discussion, and more offensive weapons. Now, what is down the road the danger? Obviously, if both sides are intending to win, we are sitting on a thermonuclear powder keg, which could explode any moment. And if it does, then that was it. And we are millimeters close to that. Now, this is why I picked up on the initiative of Pope Francis and also Secretary of State Parolin to offer the venue of the Vatican for negotiations, which should start without preconditions. And I think that's the only way how you have any hope to find a diplomatic way out of this terrible crisis. Now, a lot of people, say, "Oh, we don't like this Pope. We don't trust him because he's green." Others say, we don't like whatever other reasons they may have. Or yeah, you can't trust anybody anymore. The problem is that if we do not find a different approach, and I'm not saying that that it's not an endorsement. It's the question: look around. Where is a figure in the world who could be a credible mediation force? Fortunately, now I just learned this morning that a group of countries from the global south want Lula to be a mediator, but also representing them. Now that's very, very good, and I can only hope that that they will be successful. But still, I think what is needed is not just to stay in the field of geopolitics or interest of nations. I think what we need is a higher level of approach. And I mean, people have forgotten that the Catholic Church and the institution of the papacy over the millennia used to be, for the most part, an institution which would bring in this higher level of natural law. And that's exactly what you need, because that's why I also wrote these 10 principles of what should be the basis for a new security and development architecture. We discussed these 10 principles repeatedly, but I want to point to the last principles, the five, six, or 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, where I'm trying to bring in exactly such a higher level of thinking, that the thinking of Nicolaus of Cruz of the coincidence of opposites brings exactly in that idea that you have to think the one humanity first before you think the interest of any nation. And I'm not making a difference between one or the other. You have to think about the one humanity first in order to be able to come to a resolution of this question. So, I mean, you have talked to a lot of people as well, and maybe if you tell me what their argument was, I'm very happy to respond to it.
Well, I think one of the main things is that people are saying that the church has had financial scandals, sex scandals, the green policy, and so on. But I think what you're pointing to is something that's more profound. And I think, given what we were talking about at the beginning, the absolute violation of all international law with the lying that was now proven by their own statements, by Merkel and Hollande and Poroshenko, of course, that you have to find something that goes outside of the bubble that's controlled by these people. And, I think in this context, what we've been identifying is the role of the British Empire in using geopolitics, controlling the discussion in the United States through such institutions as Chatham House and the Atlantic Council, Council on Foreign Relations. You mentioned the Foreign Affairs article. This is what we're up against. And these are actually people who are Satanists in the sense that they don't like humanity. They hate human beings, and they're out for their own personal interests. And in that sense, Helga, I think what we're seeing from the Global South and from the initiatives you've made with the Schiller Institute is that we do stand at a point where we could break out of geopolitics once and for all. And what would that look like when you talk about relations based on mutual benefit of sovereign nations? What would that look like in this world? And where would that come from? And that's why I think this initiative is so important.
Well, as I said in the 10 principles, there are very concrete and practical things one has to solve, and they can only be solved if the major countries of the world work together. The first one, naturally, is to establish sovereignty again, because why is the sovereign nation state so important? Because it's the only form in which the individual can participate in self-government. Not in supranational institutions where the individual has no way of participating. You can see that with the EU Commission, which is a typical example of such monster creations of supranational institutions. The sovereignty is very important. That's why I made it the first principle. Secondly, you have to overcome poverty. You have to make sure people have a life as long as possible through a health system. You have to have education for everybody, because if you have no education, you can't develop your mind. You have to have a credit system which serves the common good and not the interest of a few, and so forth and so on. So I think that these kinds of questions, overcoming underdevelopment, a health system in every country, universal education for every child and adult, these are very concrete and practical questions. But I think that beyond that, once we solve what Franklin D. Roosevelt called the wants, we can move to what some people call the no-wants. These desires, which have to do not with the biological existence of man, but with his intellect, with the noosphere, as Vernadsky called it. And that is when human beings become truly human. We want to solve all diseases which presently are not solved, like cancer, like many heart and blood diseases, other rare forms of disease. I'm sure that we can find cures. We should move to have boundlessness energy by developing thermonuclear fusion as an energy source. We should seriously think about space science and space travel, and not make, like, one of the atrocities of the last days of the last year was that the head of NASA basically said that there will be space war. The US has a space force, and that Russia and China have to be denied access to space. Now that's the opposite of what is needed. We need to have international cooperation. What do you think you want to do? You want to have one nation control 2 trillion galaxies? I mean, expand the Robert Kagan wet dream to the entire universe to control 2 trillion galaxies? I mean, give me a break. The divine nature of human beings, and that is, I mean, the Pope who just died, Pope Benedict, former Cardinal Ratzinger, he has written a lot of things about the divine nature of man, which comes, is reflected in great church music, in great classical music. That divine nature has destined us to be the spacefaring species. We should really remind ourselves of our creative potential, which is unique to us as human beings. At least we have not found another species in the universe which would have similar creative capabilities. So we are, as of now, the only one. And do we want to sacrifice that by behaving like roaming pigs, and taking the trough of the other pig because we have to control that trough? I mean, that's not our nature. We should be a species of poets, of scientists, of composers, of people who celebrate their creativity through their life. And I think that I'm quite confident that is the trend of the time. And I think we should look at this present year 2023 with joy and energy to implement these designs and have a peaceful world.
Well, Helga, I think that's a good way of summing up our discussion today. The contrast between what we see from the Merkel and Hollande's as opposed to your conception, which was shaped by your long collaboration with your husband about the potential for human beings to transform the universe for the benefit of fellow human beings into the future. So, Helga, thanks for joining us. We will be having a series of events coming up in the next month, including January 8th with Diane Sayre, and then a couple more events. People should check on our websites to see when they're going to be and to sign up for them. So, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again next week.
I should mention one event next Tuesday. That's January 10th. We will have an event on these strategic matters, including with Reme Govern and Scott Ritter and several people from Europe as well. So you should absolutely tune into that if you want to have real good entertainment.
Well, and you'll find the information for that on the schillerinstitute.com website. Okay, so Helga, thanks, and see you next week then. See you.
Next week.